On the afternoon of January 15th, 2009, at New York's LaGuardia Airport, 150 passengers and 5 crew members boarded U.S. Airways Flight 1549. Among the passengers was a newborn baby, held in her mother's arms. The flight was being piloted by Captain Chesley Sullenberger, an experienced former military pilot. Alongside him was First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, who was also very experienced but new to flying the Airbus A320. This Airbus A320 was equipped with 2 CFM56 engines. The flight crew was on a 4-day-long duty schedule. It was their last journey. After this flight, they were going back home. That day, the plane had already made one trip, and this was its second flight of the day. According to the cockpit voice recorder, the pre-takeoff procedures were completely normal. The pilots were chatting and joking lightly, showing they had no idea about the disaster that was about to happen. There were a few minor issues, like a mistake in the load sheet, which was quickly fixed. Also, the first officer was having some trouble with the transmission button, and he mentioned noting it down in the technical log. The plane took off. I was taking a taxi to the airport in New York for runway 4, and everything seemed completely normal. First Officer Jeff Skiles was the pilot flying this flight. He was the one actually flying the plane. Captain Sully Sullenberger was handling the radio and acting as the pilot monitoring. Before we get into the actual flight, I want to tell you 2 things. First Officer Jeffrey Skiles was an experienced officer with over 15,000 hours of flying time, and he had flown many different types of aircraft, including there were 100 Boeing 737s, but they had just started flying the Airbus A320, and on the day of the accident, they only had 37 hours of experience with it. This info is important because it affected how they handled their roles during the incident. Another thing is, back then, U.S. Airways had 2 types of Airbus A320 planes, one fully equipped for long flights over water, and the other not. The fully equipped planes had life jackets for every passenger and special emergency gear. There were slides that could also be used as boats in emergencies. These slides were connected to the emergency doors at the front and back of the plane. Luckily, even though they weren't flying over water that day, they were still piloting a plane built to float on water. At 3:25 p.m., Cactus 1549 got clearance to take off from runway 4. The captain pushed the throttle to full power, and First Officer Skiles lifted the plane into the air. When they reached about 700 feet, the captain contacted the radio, saying they were at 700 feet and climbing to 5,000 feet. The controller replied that they were allowed to climb up to 15,000 feet, which Captain Sullenberger accepted. About 2 minutes into the flight, when the plane was at 2,815 feet and around 8 kilometers from LaGuardia Airport, Captain Sullenberger suddenly shouted, "Birds!" Right after that, the cockpit voice recorder picked up sounds of explosions and the engines losing power. This warning made it clear that the plane was in serious trouble. The plane had hit a flock of large Canada geese. 1 Canada geese weighs off. Both engines weigh about 35 kilos each and had swallowed at least 2 Canada geese. 1 goose hit the outside of the engine and flew out through the bypass duct, while the other went deep inside the engine, causing serious damage to critical parts. The damage was so bad that both engines shut down and couldn't be restarted, but the pilots had no idea this had happened. As soon as the bird strike occurred, the cockpit voice recorder caught First Officer Jeff Skiles saying, "Oh," and Captain Sully saying, "R." Both engines were shutting down, and that was a big deal because the sooner the pilots realized the problem, the sooner they could act to handle the situation. In his book, the captain described those moments like this. "Within seconds, we suddenly and evenly lost thrust. It was something I'd never felt in the cockpit before. It was shocking and surprising. Even though I had a long career by then, I had never seen even one engine fail, but here both engines stopped working. They stopped doing it when both engines fail during takeoff on big planes like the Boeing 737 or Airbus A320. It feels like the plane suddenly hits a wall. The plane slows down, and the pilots quickly realize the problem is with both engines. The most impressive part of this incident is that within just 2 seconds, Captain Saley said, "I'm starting the autopilot, and I have control." Later, it turned out that this small step was really beneficial for the outcome of that flight's emergency. Normally, the captain takes control, while the first officer handles monitoring the plane and going through the checklist. But the most important thing here was that Captain Sully started the auxiliary power unit really quickly, which wasn't part of any checklist. This showed his deep experience, because he realized early on that they were really close to the ground and had very little time. Just 10 seconds later, Captain Sully, now in control of the plane, told First Officer Skiles to start the quick reference checklist, and they kept sending message after message to air traffic control, explaining what had happened. At first, they tried turning back, but while doing that, they realized they were flying way too low. Heading toward the airport would take them right over Manhattan, one of the most densely populated places in the world. That meant, if they couldn't make it to the airport, hundreds of people on the ground would be in danger. All of this had happened in just 12 seconds, showing how quickly the crew had to react. Quickly and efficiently, they assessed the situation. Just seconds later, First Officer Skalk started working on the checklist. After both engines failed at a low altitude, Captain Sunberger immediately contacted the controller to turn back toward the airport. 1529, gear what? 1549. Be left traffic, runway 1549. Runway, left traffic, take off ride. Later investigations revealed that if they had started turning towards Gowria as soon as they sensed danger, they could have landed on that same runway. Pilots are taught that in an emergency, the first priority is to keep the plane at a safe altitude, then figure out the problem, and only take action when absolutely necessary. That's exactly what Sully and his team were doing at that moment. Captain Sollenberger tried his best to keep the plane steady at green dot speed while going through the dual engine failure checklist. Now, Sully was considering several possibilities. They knew the plane had climbed to about 3,000 feet and was now starting to descend. They had to keep their speed steady and were trying to figure out what to do next. During training, pilots are taught that if your engines fail and you make a turn, you'll lose more altitude than if you just keep flying straight. Sully knew that if they turned back towards LaGuardia, they'd lose so much height they'd be out of options. Either they'd make it to LaGuardia, or they'd have to make an emergency landing in a densely populated area. What could have been a terrible situation. Sully and Jeff were at Skylander Borough Airport, but Sully quickly realized that Teterboro Airport was about 16 kilometers away, and getting there wasn't possible. She saw that trying to reach Teterboro would mean losing a lot of altitude, which was risky. So, they looked at the Hudson River as an alternative. It seemed like an open and safe spot. Right from the start, when Sully was talking with air traffic control, it was clear she was considering landing in the Hudson River. They were doing it because they had no other practical options. Flying over a densely populated city like New York, any wrong move could lead to a huge disaster. Sully quickly decided that landing in the river was the safest choice. At that moment, the captain was fully focused on controlling the plane and planning the landing, while the first officer, Jeff, was working on the checklist. Jeff's main job was to try and restart one of the engines to bring the plane back under control. About 2 minutes after the engine failure, the captain on Flight 329 used the public announcement system and made a crucial announcement. Get ready for impact. This was a very important message, because until then, the cabin crew and passengers had no clear idea of what was going on. Sully's announcement made the cabin crew aware of the seriousness of the situation, so they could prepare the passengers for an emergency landing and instruct them to brace themselves. Until that point, things had been relatively calm on the plane, but Sully's announcement changed everything. It was clear as day that this was an emergency, and the plane was about to land soon. The cabin crew had already sensed something was wrong, but Sully's announcement made it clear how serious the situation was. As the plane started descending, Sully noticed it was losing speed slowly. Then, all kinds of warning alarms went off in the plane. First, there was the engine failure warning, followed by the traffic collision avoidance system alert since they were flying over New York, where there were plenty of other helicopters and planes nearby. Along with that, the ground. The proximity warning system also started going off, indicating that the plane was coming very close to the ground. GPWS is a really important warning, especially when a plane is about to hit a mountain or a building. In this situation, Sully and Skiles were planning to land. If they had a ditching checklist for landing on water, It would have instructed them to turn off the GPWS system, because in that case, the warning wouldn't be helpful. But they still had one engine running. They were following the failure checklist designed more for engine failure at high altitude, which is why the GPWS warning kept going off, making it hard for them to focus on landing. About 2.5 minutes after the engine failed, around 329,000, the first officer realized they wouldn't be able to restart the engine. Still, they kept flipping the switches as per the checklist, and signaled Sally that their attempts weren't working. By this time, both the captain and the first officer understood that they couldn't get the engine back on. They can't restart and will have to land without power. Jeff suggested to Sally to try pushing the thrust lever forward to see if the engine would respond at all. If the engine could give even a little power, the landing might have been a bit better. But Sally clearly realized there was no response from the engine. Now the plane was really close to the water, and Sally was getting ready to bring the plane down for landing. Though their speed was very low as the plane approached the water, Sully asks Jeff if he has any suggestions. Jeff replies, "No, I don't have any suggestions." This shows that Sully made sure until the last moment that nothing important was missed. When the captain tries to land the plane, because of the slow speed and alpha floor protection, the plane didn't rise as much as they wanted. He pulled the stick all the way back, but the plane still hit the water hard. The force of the plane landing on the water was greater than what the Airbus A320 was designed for, which affected the rear part of the plane. I took a big hit, and the left engine broke off. But the plane slowed down gradually and settled in the water. Because of the damage to the back, water started leaking in, and the rear part began to sink. After successfully landing on the water, the pilot said to the others, "This wasn't as hard as we thought, but they knew they had to get the passengers out safely, since the public address system wasn't working." So Captain Sally got up himself and shouted at the flight attendants, saying, "They started getting the passengers out quickly." The captain was glad to see the attendants were already doing it. The Airbus A320 is designed to float if it lands on water, so the emergency exits can be used. Luckily, there was enough space on the wings and near the tail for all 150 passengers and 5 crew members. After the incident, we saw passengers standing on the wings and the front part of the plane. Air traffic control immediately contacted the New York Port Authority. The people who sent out the boats within minutes managed to get the passengers out safely. Even though the weather was really cold and most of the passengers were soaking wet, if the boat hadn't arrived on time, there could have been fatalities. The water temperature was just 5 degrees Celsius, which is super cold. Most passengers climbed onto the plane's wings without getting hurt, but one passenger panicked and jumped into the water, trying to swim to shore. However, because of the cold, he had to turn back. Meanwhile, the boat captain they saw the plane going down and quickly rushed to help. Within minutes, all the passengers were safely brought to shore with the help of boats. Once the plane settled in the water, Sully and Jeff went into the cabin to make sure all the passengers and crew had gotten out safely. Then, Captain and the first officer were the last to exit through the front emergency exit of the plane. 4 hours later, it was clear that everyone had survived. Captain Sully later described that moment as an immense and unbelievable relief. The air traffic controller who tried to help Flight 1549 was immediately taken off duty. That's standard procedure after any aircraft accident. He was taken to a room with no TV or internet, where he was questioned and investigated. Later, he found out the plane hadn't crashed, which he couldn't believe, because he thought everyone must have died. The plane floated on the Hudson River and eventually got stuck near the riverbank. It was pulled out a few days later. After the U.S. Airways Flight 1549 incident, it became clear that the main cause of the accident was a collision of Canadian geese with both engines of the plane. These large, heavy birds were flying at about 3,000 feet when they struck both engines. After this incident, the world saw Captain Chesley Sullenberger as a hero. He made the right decisions under extremely difficult circumstances and safely landed the plane on the Hudson River, saving all 155 passengers. But as the investigation progressed, a new twist emerged. The National Transportation Safety Board's inquiry began to question whether Captain Sullenberger had. Why didn't they try to land at the nearest airport? Investigators ran simulator tests, and some pilots managed to either bring the plane down safely after hitting birds or successfully reach Teterboro Airport. This made the situation even more serious. Did Solberger make a rushed decision to head toward the river? That was a big question challenging Solberger's reputation. But the real story doesn't end here. Solberger and several experts argued that the actual accident conditions aren't like those in a simulator, especially when the plane suddenly hits birds. If the two engines fail after colliding, the startle effect, that sudden shock, causes the pilot to hesitate for a few seconds before making decisions. They said that in real situations, factors like stress and lack of time come into play, which can't really be felt in a simulator. When NTSB added a 35-second delay in the simulator tests to mimic real conditions, the results completely changed. This time, no pilot was able to safely land the plane at the airport. They all ended up crashing. This is what made Sulzberger's case stronger for the NTSB. B finally admitted that Sullenberger's decision to land on the Hudson River wasn't just right, but actually the only way to save everyone's lives. This investigation cleared up all the doubts about Sullenberger. Factors like calm weather, smooth water, and the rescue teams being close by all helped increase the chances of survival. After the accident, aviation safety experts looked into it and concluded that hitting large birds like Canadian geese could cause serious crashes in the future. They started considering various measures to prevent this. One suggestion was, it was also suggested to put mesh or screens in front of the engines to stop birds, but that wasn't technically possible because it would affect the engine's performance and could cause ice buildup. The timeline is tied.
Special efforts were made at New York and other airports to prevent bird strikes. These campaigns used different methods to remove Canada geese from around the airports, including controlled culling. Thousands of Canada geese and their eggs were destroyed by coating them with oil. According to government data, over 700 Canadian geese have been killed so far, and their nests and eggs destroyed to prevent them from having chicks.
After this incident, several suggestions were made to improve aviation safety. Pilots are now recommended to get training for emergency situations, including both engines filling at low altitude. There's also a recognized need to improve emergency exit checklists and safety equipment. Because of all this, Captain Sullenberger and his team are being called heroes. His quick thinking, smart decisions, and teamwork helped prevent a major disaster. Now, this event is known as the Miracle on the Hudson. If this video surprised you, the next story will blow your mind even more. Check out the next video about a plane crash whose truth is still hidden today. Click here to find out the real story, and I'll see you in a second. Thanks.